Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CFP Board's webinar on the roadmap to the new Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. My name is Leo Rajeski. I'm the General Counsel of CFP Board and the Managing Director of Professional Standards. And I'm here with Kevin Ruth, a member of our Standards Resource Commission. Kevin's been a CFP professional for 20 years. Kevin, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Leo.
So the purpose of this webinar today is to provide you with an overview of a new guidance resource that CFP Board has issued, and it was issued by our Standards Resource Commission. This roadmap to the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct is intended to be a handy reference guide for CFP professionals and their firms. And the roadmap introduces the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. So the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct were issued back in March of 2018 and have an effective date of October 1st, 2019, and an enforcement date of June 30th, 2020. Our Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct addresses the Code of Ethics and then has duties to clients, duties to firms and subordinates, and duties to CFP Board. The roadmap to the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct was developed by CFP Board's Standards Resource Commission, Kevin Ruth being a member of that group. So the Standards Resource Commission was formed to help develop resources that will provide guidance to CFP professionals and their firms on CFP Board's Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. The members of the Standards Resource Commission are individuals from financial services firms, as well as members of the public, and the Commission is helping develop materials such as fact sheets, FAQs, videos, webinars, and other documents. And the Commission is being led by Blaine Aiken, the former chair of the board of CFP Board. The roadmap is an important guidance resource that the Standards Resource Commission has issued. It's a handy reference guide for CFP professionals and their firms that was developed with the assistance of staff, as well as members of CFP Board's Business Model Council, which is a council composed of representatives of approximately 30 firms that provide feedback to CFP Board concerning our standards. Now, Kevin, you are very involved in the development of this roadmap. Can you tell everybody a little bit more about the purpose?
Sure, Leo, thanks. So one of the things we wanted to do is one of the first pieces of material that we put out with the Standard Resources Commission. And one of the things we wanted to do is really try to take the 14-page code and standards that is, a Word document and try to make it come to life, actually put some visualization to it. So you'll see as we go through this today, we've done some charts, we've got some graphs, and we've even created some checklists for you. So we really wanted to bring this to life and actually give practitioners really a practical understanding and really an overview of the structure of how the codes and standards is laid out. So what I want to do is just walk you through the table of contents, and then we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail. So the roadmap is, just so you know, is not all inclusive of the code and standards. What we've done is want to highlight a number of the areas that we thought would be great to pull out. So we're going to go through today the duties of the CFP professional. We're going to go through the fiduciary duty, which is a really big thing when it comes to the code and standards. We're going to talk about the financial advice framework and kind of when are you giving financial advice versus financial planning. Then we actually go into a little more detail on when am I providing financial planning, and then some detail on when am I providing financial advice. And also, if I am providing financial planning, then what are the new practice standards that I must follow if I'm doing financial planning. And then lastly, we're going to cover the duty information that we need to provide to a client. What also you're going to see in the roadmap is a number of appendices. There's 5 of them that really go in much further detail of how you can actually comply with the new code and standards, and we're going to walk you through that in a little bit more detail. So just let's give an overview of the code and standards. So really, we believe that these are really the principles that should guide our behavior as CFP professionals. And what we're going to go through today, these code of ethics apply at all times. So we're going to talk to you today about some parts of the code that apply when you're doing financial advice, some parts of the code when you're doing financial planning, but the code and ethics apply at all times. And you can see there are 6 tenets to the code of ethics. You have to act with honesty, integrity, competence, and diligence. You have to act in the client's best interest, exercise due care, avoid or disclose and manage conflict of interest, maintain the confidentiality and protect the privacy of a client information, and then act in a manner that reflects positively on the financial planning profession and the CFP professional. Let me go on to the next one here. So there are several duties that you'll find in the code, and Leo mentioned these: duties to clients, duties to your firm or other professionals, and duties to the CFP board. What we wanted to do is we wanted to create a slide for you here that could actually go into some detail of what those duties are. And so we made this in a very color-coordinated way. So there's duties that apply at all time. As we mentioned, the Code of Ethics applies at all time, but there's also several of the duties that apply to clients at all times. You can see those are integrity, competence, diligence, grounded objective professional judgment, professionalism, complying with the law, confidentiality and privacy, duties when communicating with the client, duties when representing compensation method, duties when selecting, using, and recommending technology, and refraining from borrowing or lending money, commingling financial assets. So those are duties that apply to a client, but at all times there's other duties that apply to firms and subordinates: using reasonable care with supervising, complying with lawful objectives of CFP professional firms, and provide notice of public discipline. And then there's also, at all times, duties that apply to the CFP board: to refrain from adverse conduct, reporting, provide narrative statements, cooperation, and compliance with the terms and conditions of certification and trademark license. So those duties apply at all time. But if you're going to be giving financial advice, there are additional duties that apply. And so we put that in blue here for you. And so, of course, if you're now providing financial advice, all the duties in yellow, of course, still apply. But then you also have the fiduciary duty, and that is one of the changes to the new code and standards, is that you have a fiduciary duty now when you're providing financial advice to a client. You also have to disclose and manage your conflict of interest, provide information to a client, and duties when recommending, engaging, and working with additional persons. And then lastly, if the financial advice you're giving requires financial planning, we have the dark blue. So, of course, everything in the yellow and the lighter blue apply. But then if you're doing financial planning, you also have to do the Practice 7 standard. That's the 7-step financial planning process. And a lot of the information that you were providing to the client, maybe verbally, orally, when you were giving financial advice, you now have to do those disclosures in writing. And we're going to get into a lot more as we move through this. So if you think about this as a bullseye, you kind of have the outer circle, which is what are your duties that you have at all time as a CFP professional? Those are the ones in yellow. And then if you start giving a client financial advice, and we're going to get into what financial advice means, it's where you're making recommendations to clients, that's that light blue. And then you have the dark blue in providing financial planning. And so that's kind of the structure of how we've laid out these duties that apply to clients, firms and subordinates, and the CFP board. Leo, before I turn it back to you, I have our first question that came in here. Do the duties apply even if I'm not getting paid by the client? And the answer is yes to that. The duties still apply. There's no requirement that compensation has to be provided for the standards to apply. So the standards apply even if you're doing pro bono work.
So thank you, Kevin. So the roadmap is an overview. It's a guide to the code and standards. It doesn't replace the code and standards, and not everything that's in the code and standards is set forth in the roadmap. So this slide that Kevin has presented, these duties of a CFP professional, we're not going to be covering the details of all of those today. Each one of these duties has operative language in our standards that explains what they mean. We've provided them in this roadmap to be a user guide to orient you to the existence of these different duties so that you can see them collectively to understand in a more easily identifiable way what these duties are, how they relate to each other, and when they apply. Some of these, of course, we'll go into in greater detail. And one of those is the one I'll turn to now, which is really the cornerstone of CFP Board's Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct, and this is the fiduciary duty. So the fiduciary duty says that at all times when providing financial advice to a client, And those terms, by the way, are defined in the glossary to the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. So when providing financial advice to a client, a CFP professional must act as a fiduciary and therefore act in the best interest of the client. So what does that mean? What does it mean to act as a fiduciary acting in the best interest of the client? So the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct walks through what that means. So the fiduciary duty, this is almost like a simple math equation. It equals, first and foremost, the duty of loyalty. So there are three components to the duty of loyalty. It's a CFP professional placing the interest of the client above the interests of the CFP professional and the CFP professional's firm. There's also a conflict issue here. So we recognize at CFP Board that CFP professionals have conflicts of interest. We understand that and recognize that and have a standard that addresses it. So a CFP professional can either avoid the conflicts of interest, or they may fully disclose them to the client, obtain the client's informed consent, and then properly manage the conflict. The third element of the duty of loyalty is that in providing services to the client, it's acting without regard to the financial interests of the CFP professional, the CFP professional's firm, or any individual or entity other than the client. And the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct actually explains what that means. Under our code and standards, what that means is that a CFP professional acting under a conflict continues to have a duty to act in the best interest of the client and place the client's interest above the CFP professionals. So in addition to the duty of loyalty, there's a duty of care. So the duty of care means that a CFP professional must act with the care, skill, prudence, and diligence that a prudent professional would exercise in light of the client's goals, risk tolerance, objectives, and financial and personal circumstances. Now, as we all know, there are times when a client has their own desire to take a certain act. They have their own goals that they are seeking to achieve, and at times they may instruct a CFP professional to do something, and the instruction from the client may be different from what the CFP professional believes should be done under the duty of care. The CFP professional does have a duty to follow client instructions. So the standards say that a CFP professional must comply with the terms of the client engagement and follow the directions of the client that are reasonable and lawful. So read together, these are the three components of CFP Board's fiduciary duty, which is identified in the Code and Standards as the first of the duties to a client.
We may have got a question on this one, Leo.
Oh, we do, Kevin. Thank you. So we were asked, does the fiduciary standard eliminate transactional business? In other words, can somebody be providing transactional services where they're receiving commissions or sales-related compensation and act as a fiduciary? So the fiduciary duty does not eliminate transactional business. CFP professionals in all business models are able to comply with CFP Board's fiduciary duty. In fact, most CFP professionals offer transactional services to their clients. So thank you for that question. Now let's turn to probably one of the most important slides in the roadmap. And this is a discussion of the financial advice framework. So CFP professionals, when they interact with clients, have a number of different ways they may interact. And with respect to CFP Board's Code and Standards, a threshold question that arises is, am I providing financial advice to a client? So as Kevin mentioned earlier when you described the duties, some apply at all times, some apply when you're providing financial advice, and some apply when you're providing financial advice that requires financial planning. So since there is this framework, one of the first questions is, are you providing that financial advice? Well, if you're not providing financial advice, then what that means is the fiduciary duty does not apply, because the fiduciary duty applies at all times when providing financial advice. If you're not providing financial advice, that duty is not in place. However, a CFP professional continues to have a duty to abide by the Code of Ethics and some of the other standards, but the fiduciary duty is not one of them. If you are providing financial advice to a client, then the fiduciary duty does apply. And it leads to another question. If you're providing financial advice, does the financial advice you're providing require you to provide financial planning? And again, under the framework, if the answer is no, the fiduciary duty still applies because the fiduciary duty applies to all financial advice. But a CFP professional is not required to apply the practice standards for the financial planning process. That is a consequence of the outcome when you're providing financial advice that does not require financial planning. If a CFP professional is providing financial advice and that financial advice requires financial planning, then the next question is, does the client agree to engage the CFP professional for financial planning? If the answer is no, the client says that they do not want to receive financial planning, again, the fiduciary duty applies, but a CFP professional is not required to apply the practice standards. But if the client does agree to engage for financial planning, then what that means is that the CFP professional is to apply the practice standards for the financial planning process. So this financial advice framework in the roadmap is intended to be, again, a graphical illustration as a user's guide to think through how does this advice framework work within CFP Board's code and standards. Kevin?
Yeah, so then the first question, in that framework is, am I providing financial advice? And so what we thought we'd do is give you a little more breakdown on what it means to provide financial advice and what does it mean to not be providing financial advice. So what is financial advice? The communication that's based on its content, context, and presentation would reasonably be viewed as a recommendation that the client take or refrain from taking a particular course of action with respect to the development or implementation of a financial plan, the value or the advisability of investing in purchasing, holding, gifting, or selling financial assets, and financial assets as defined in the code and standards, investment policies or strategies, portfolio composition, the management of financial assets or other financial matters, or the selection or retention of other persons to provide financial or professional services to a client. So that would be a recommendation or a referral to another professional. And then, of course, if you're providing discretionary authority over financial assets, that would also be considered financial advice. So to me, when I look at that, again, it's that recommendation. It's been reasonably viewed as a recommendation that the client would take or refrain from taking a course of action. So what's not financial advice? It's where you'd reasonably not be viewed as making a recommendation. So it's a communication that, based on its content, context, and presentation, would not be reasonably viewed as a recommendation. So if a client calls you and directs you to do an order or trade or some type of action, that would not be considered financial advice. Or if the communications you're making are for marketing material or general financial education or very general financial communications, so not very specific to a client situation, not customized for a client, but very generic, either from an educational standpoint or marketing materials. So it's important, though, to know that the determination of whether financial advice has been provided is an objective rather than a subjective inquiry, and that the more individually tailored, so the more customized the communication is to the client, the more likely that that communication will be viewed as financial advice. So now that we know what financial advice is, how do we know if the financial advice we are giving rises to the financial planning? So there's a three-part test or three categories that you know if you're going to be providing financial advice that requires financial planning. The first one is, have I agreed to provide or have I provided financial planning? That's pretty simple. That means you and your client have agreed that you're going to be providing financial planning, so then you would be doing financial advice that requires financial planning. The bottom one, does the client have a reasonable basis to believe that I will provide or have provided financial planning? So this is really, what does the client believe? So what have you communicated to them? How have you marketed yourself? What are the client's expectations based on the interactions you've had with them? And are they coming away with those interactions thinking that they're going to be receiving financial planning? But a lot of times we don't actually have a formal agreement, or maybe haven't even talked about financial planning. And so the middle one is where I think I think a lot of us are going to see, does this apply for us to have financial planning, which is really, does the financial advice I've agreed to provide require integration of relevant elements of the client's personal and or financial circumstances in order to act in the client's best interest, taking into account the integration factors set forth to the right. So there are 5 integration factors. And what you have to do is you have to go through these integration factors to really determine if the financial advice you were given needs to really be financial planning. So the first one is the number of relevant elements of a client's personal and financial circumstances that the financial advice may apply. So how broadly are you giving your financial advice to the client on numerous topics? How much of is it very narrow advice that you're giving, or are you giving broad advice on a number of financial topics? The second one is the portion and the amount of the client's financial assets that the financial advice may affect. So are you making a recommendation on a small portion of a client's assets, or are you really talking to the client about most of their net worth or most of their investable assets? That's how that integration factor would be weighed. Then also the length of time that the client's personal and financial circumstances may be affected by the financial advice. So is your financial advice, is it talking about a 30 or 40-year retirement plan and clients, what they're going to do over that 30 or 40 years? Is it something very short term? What's the length of time that the client's personal and financial circumstances may be affected? Number 4 is the effect on the client's overall exposure to risk if a client implements the financial advice. So how much of their risk profile changes or overall exposure to risk change based on the financial advice that you're giving? And then the last one, the barriers to modifying the actions taken to implement the financial advice. So if a client does implement your advice, how hard would it be for them to undo what they've done if they decide at some point in the future that they no longer want to go along with that action that you had recommended? So how hard is it to get out of what was recommended? So based on those integration factors, you could hit those integration factors, and your financial advice that you would give in could become financial planning. And if it becomes financial planning, then you need to follow the 7-step practice standards that we're going to go through. So then you can ask yourself, well, what if the client doesn't want financial planning, or what if for some reason I'm not able to do financial planning either because of my business practice or how my firm operates? So there's 4 things you can do that if the client doesn't agree to engage you for financial planning. You can, of course, just not enter into the engagement, which means you're just not going to engage the client in whatever activities they've asked you to engage in. The second thing you could do is you can limit the scope. So if your practice is really focused on maybe just investment management and you don't do a lot of the other financial planning categories, you could limit the scope of the engagement to the services that do not require the application of the practice standards for the financial planning process, and describe to the client the services that the client requests that you as a CFP professional will not be performing. The client may not want to do financial planning, which is the third one, which the client says, you know what, I don't want to do financial planning. I only want you to do a retirement analysis for me, or I only want you to do is an insurance analysis for me. Provide the requested service after informing the client how financial planning will benefit the client and how the decision not to enter into the financial planning engagement may limit the financial advice. Of course, the last one, if it's already an existing client, you could always terminate the engagement. So those are the 4 ways where if you believe you should be doing financial planning for a client, but for either a reason you can't do financial planning based on your the services you provide, or the client doesn't want it, how you can not have to follow the practice standards.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a lot on that slide. This is another really important slide in the roadmap, because we're often asked about this line between financial advice and financial planning. And within the code and standards, there's a lot of material, but this one page hopefully provides a really good overview and lays out what a CFP professional needs to be thinking about in making that determination.
Leo, we got another question regarding this. So the question is, what do we do with clients who want asset management, for example, but do not want us to prepare a financial plan or provide financial planning? So that is where, if you as the CFP professional thinks the client would benefit from financial planning, but you only do investment management, you can limit the scope of the engagement. So that would be the second bullet there. Limit the scope of the engagement to services that do not require application of the practice standards for the client for the financial planning process, and describe to the client the services the client requests that the CFP professional will not be performing.
Great. So thank you for asking these questions as we go through. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we're trying to handle the questions as they come in relating to the slides we're addressing. And depending upon where we are at the end of the hour, if we have time then, we'll seek to entertain some additional questions. But now let's talk about the practice standards for the financial planning process. This is really important. You know, the people who developed the practice standards for the financial planning process years ago were visionary. It was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when they came up with this process. They did some great work. And the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct really builds upon that by refining these in some ways, adding greater detail. And in case you haven't heard, there's been a slight reorientation of the standards that's had us go from 6 steps in the financial planning process to there now being 7. And a roadmap to the code and standards really would be remiss if it didn't go through these 7 steps of the financial planning process. So let's do a brief overview here. So the first step is understanding the client's personal and financial circumstances. This is actually an important change in the code and standards. It says before you're going to provide advice to the client, you have to understand things about the client. You need to gather information and learn about the personal and financial circumstances so that you're in a position to move forward in the process. So once you're armed with that information, we move forward to identifying and selecting goals. So financial planning is a very goals-based approach. Early in the process, you work with the client after you've learned their circumstances to think, what are we trying to do? What are the goals that we have? And that moves forward to analyzing their current course of action. What they're doing right now may be appropriate for them, and that may be the right way to go. But there could be potentially alternative courses of action that would better serve the client's interests. So the CFP professional then engages in the analysis and develops a financial planning recommendation. Now, previously, developing and presenting the recommendation had been part of the same step in the process, but CFP board, the board of directors, and the Commission on Standards that helped develop these materials concluded that developing the recommendation and presenting it were actually 2 different steps in the process, and more we're finding that the person developing it is not the person who's presenting it, which is just a further illustration for why these are different steps in the process. And then after that, the 6th step in the process is implementing the financial planning recommendations. You have the recommendation, let's move forward and implement it. And then for many of you, the 7th step of the process is really where all the action is, because maybe it's a client you've had for 15 or 20 years or so. And what you're doing in the life cycle of your relationship with the client is that you're monitoring their progress and updating. In some ways, this is a bit of a do-over of the prior 6 steps. But this together are the practice standards for the financial planning process, which now are 7 steps. And of course, the practice standards also have a documentation requirement. It's a very principles-based standard. It says that a CFP professional must act prudently in documenting information as the facts and circumstances require, taking into account a number of factors. How significant is the information? Do we need to preserve the information in writing? Let's always think about the obligation acting in the client's best interest. And then your firm may have policies and procedures about documentation that become relevant to this as well. CFP board was very flexible in the code and standards in thinking about how you might document. There's a lot of different options in the roadmap. We list some options for doing it. And we think as a best practice, when you're in doubt, a good way to go on that front is to document. So when in doubt, document. If you have any question about it, we think that that's a best practice for you. So CFP board also has historically provided disclosure requirements. We call this in the code and standards the duty to provide information to a client. And there are different categories of information that are required. And how you provide them depends on whether you're providing financial advice or whether you're providing financial planning. And we're going to talk in a minute about some disclosure guides that we prepared, one that applies for financial advice engagements, one that applies for financial planning engagements. Again, these guys provide in greater detail the duty to provide the information. Here, we're just going to go through a brief summary of the categories that must be shared with the client and whether it must be orally or in writing. The requirements are set forth in our standards, by the way, are in addition to any requirements that apply under applicable law. So if the law requires you to provide additional information, that's beyond what we have. But here's what CFE Board requires. Let's start first when it's financial advice. You'll notice on the left what must be in writing. This is the privacy policy. So Reg SP, if you're regulated under Reg SP, that's a requirement that you already have. That's something that under CFE Board standards always has to be provided in writing. The rest of these here, when it's financial advice, you could do it orally or you could do it in writing. So material conflicts of interest, the services and products you're offering, how the client pays, how you, your firm, and related parties are compensated, public discipline and bankruptcy, as well as referral compensation arrangements. So that's when you're being compensated for referral, and then any other material information that's material to the client also needs to be provided to the client. So let's contrast this with when you're providing financial planning. As you can see, the primary difference here is when they must be provided in writing. And now we have a shift where just about everything has to be provided in writing. There's only one category that does not, and that's material conflicts of interest. The standard that we have walks through in great detail, material conflicts, the standard for material conflicts, and it's certainly a best practice to provide that in writing, but technically the standards allow you to do it orally or in writing. The same categories of information that I mentioned before all are to be provided in writing, but here we add a new one. This is in bold in the roadmap. It's the terms of the engagement. Those terms, the details of those terms, what must be provided, are set forth in the Code of Standards. Again, we're not providing everything in the roadmap, but we're using this as a user's guide to help orient you to the Code and Standards. But one element here that's important to note, that the implementing, monitoring, and updating requirements must be provided unless they're explicitly excluded from the agreement. So when you're thinking about the terms of the engagement, whether you're going to be providing implementing, monitoring, and updating, that's something that's really important to be thinking about because you'll want to address it there.
So Leo just kind of walked through the duties to provide information to a client and the fact that some things have to be in writing and you can do other things either in writing or orally. And so what we wanted to do with the commission is actually try to be helpful in pointing out to where you already may have documents that exist that are actually doing some of these, providing this information to clients, so you wouldn't need to duplicate it. And so we created an Appendix 1 of the roadmap. If you're providing financial advice engagement, we provided a disclosure guide to say, here's how can you find things that you may already be providing in your firm to communicate with the clients. And then in Appendix 2, it's based on a financial planning engagement disclosure guide, which is different, as Leo showed, because a lot of the things that you can do orally with financial advice, you have to then do in writing with financial planning. So we're not going to walk through each of these appendices, but what we wanted to do is just take you through an example of one so you can get a sense for how it's laid out and what type of information is being conveyed in these disclosure guides. So the first thing we do is say, what information must I share? So those are the requirements that are in the code and standard of what things that you need to be providing to a client if you're doing financial advice. Service and products, how is the client paid, how am I compensated? We then point out where you might be able to find those in existing material that your firm has already created or you've already created for your firm. And you can see there's a fairly long list. We tried to be very exhaustive on where we could find some of that information, again, that may already exist that you don't need to create newly for the code and standard. Then in the third column, we try to say, and when must you provide it? So when must this information be communicated either orally or in writing to the client? And then lastly, how do I have to do it? And that's truly, is it an oral communication or a written communication? So that's how that guide is laid out.
So Kevin, one point here, you'll see in this column where it talks about where may this information which documents already may contain the information. Somebody has a question today asking, well, what about the new Reg BI that's come out in Form CRS? And so we had a conversation today, Kevin, where the Standards Resource Commission is going to be updating this roadmap to include the Form CRS requirements here in the area where it talks about which documents may contain the information. So be on the lookout for that. We're aware about Form CRS, and we're already planning on updating this document to include that information.
I did get a question specific about disclosure, Leo. So is a CFP professional required to disclose the dollar amount of the commission received from a transaction? So the code and standards does not specifically require that, but what the CFP board has said in their commentary is that if a client requests that information, that the CFP professional is to provide that information to the best of his or her ability.
One other question we got in is a bit of a technical point. Are these slides available? What you'll notice later, if you haven't already looked at the roadmap, is what we're providing to you is the roadmap. So if you're looking for these slides really, the slides themselves don't provide any information that's not in the roadmap. So if you're looking for the slide deck, encourage you instead, pull down the roadmap. It's not a long document. Take a look and review it. All the information is contained there. Okay, let's talk about the practice standards now. So we've always had a practice standards reference guide. So in some sense, this is really just an update. But the practice standards reference guide, as you can see here, it's about seven substantive slides. It's in some ways an abbreviated version of the practice standards. It's a guide that helps orient you to what, how this works. And we provided a sample here just to show you what is set forth in the guide. So we provide first a brief summary of the standards. For example, obtain qualitative and quantitative information. You describe to the client the information concerning their circumstances that you need to fulfill the engagement, and then you collaborate with the client to obtain the information. This is what's set in the practice standards. This is a short user's guide overview of that. We also provide some tips for you to think about. We have some examples of qualitative and quantitative information. They're set forth below. What we've heard already from CFP professionals during our public forums that we've held around the country is that these examples become very helpful. In some ways, CFP professionals are using them as checklists. As I'm trying to gather information from a client, let's go through each of these and see whether there's information we need with respect to these categories of information. So the practice standards reference guide, goes through each step of the financial planning process and provides the standards as well as some tips.
Yes, so the last two guides that we've included in the roadmap are the compliance guides, and what these try to do is actually they are checklists of the code and standards. And so we tried to actually just create checklists for if you're in a financial advice engagement or if you're in a financial planning engagement, where you could use these guides to kind of see and just double check to make sure that you're complying with the code and standards. And so what we wanted to do is just kind of show you an example of just a little piece of it. And you can see, so this is really just language that's pulled right out of the 14-page Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. But you'll see it has check marks next to it where you could go, as you go through this, you can say, duty of loyalty, have I placed the interests of my client above the interests of me and my firm? Check. Have I avoided conflict of interest or fully disclosed non-material conflict of interest? Check. And you can continue to work your way through these compliance guides to make sure that you are complying with the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. And we've done it for not only financial advice, but we've also done it for financial planning engagement, where you can still go through and have these check marks to say, am I complying with the code and standard?
Kevin, before we go on to some of the other guidance resources we have, I just want to touch briefly on these documents. So right now, CFP Board has some compliance guides for our current standards of professional conduct, and they're actually the most downloaded document on CFP Board's website. So these documents that Kevin mentioned, they're all available. They're collected together. This is a question I've seen pop up right now over and over again from the question feed is, where can we get the roadmap? where can we get these guides? Where you go is cfp.net/code. cfp.net/code. All of these materials are provided there. You can download the roadmap. The roadmap contains these guides. They're available for you to use. They're very helpful. CFP professionals tell us over and over again that they use guides like this when they're working with an individual client as a bit of a checklist where they go through, have I done these things? Let me follow through this compliance guide as a tool to use to help with compliance. Okay, so now we're really thinking now about other guidance resources that CFP Board has issued. We've gone through the roadmap. The roadmap is not the only guidance resource. So it all starts with the materials we put out back in March of 2018. These materials contain a lot of the answers to the questions you're asking, a lot of information that's useful to you. How does this compare to what we have now? So the easiest way to see that is to go to the side-by-side comparison. This document contains the new standards. It shows what the prior standard used to say, so you're able to look at that yourself and see that. The commentary is what you might expect it to be given the title. The commentary walks through the code and standards, talks about the reasons why certain standards were adopted, goes through some of the feedback that CFP Board received. You know, Kevin, we had more than 1,000 comments to our code and standards, and we read every one of them. We read every one. We met with firms and individuals, had 2 rounds of comments, and really carefully thought through, the Board of Directors did, the Commission on Standards did, thinking through what's the right standard for CFP Board, and the commentary is a great place to go through and look at all that. Somebody asked in the question feed, you know, are there other resources that are available to us as we're learning what's in the new code and standards? Well, this is the primary reason for the new Ethics CE program. This was new for CFP Board to have an Ethics CE program that was developed by CFP professionals working with staff, the primary purpose of which is to educate CFP professionals on the new code and standards. So there are 5 learning objectives, the first of which is to identify the significant changes. And as you work through the learning objectives, acting in accordance with the fiduciary duty, applying the practice standards, you know, identifying when you must provide information to a client, and then, of course, dealing with conflicts. Have any of you already participated in a CFP Board Ethics CE program? Has anybody already gone through and participated in what's now the 2-hour CE requirement at CFP Board? Okay, it looks like many of you already have. You know, we're always evaluating our CE programs. So far, what we've heard is that the CE program has been really helpful to learning more about the code and standards. So there are many ways to gain a better understanding of what's in the document. Reading it's the best way, but also attending an Ethics CE program. It's a much deeper dive than the roadmap can provide. The roadmap is a user's guide. It's an orientation to the standards. The CE program goes in greater detail the elements of that document.
So Leo, we got a question about the compliance guides, and it looks like people seem to like the compliance guides. So they asked a question, kind of a follow-up. Will the CFP Board prepare sample financial planning engagements or sample agreements that comply with the new standard? And the answer is most definitely yes. That's something that the Standard Resource Commission will be working on, those documents, and we'll have them out before the effectiveness of this the actual new code and standard. But that is definitely something we will work on. And any other things that you think would be helpful for you to feel you're comfortable to be fully compliant, please send those suggestions into us, because the Standard Resource Commission is made up of a number of industry professionals, people from large firms, small firms, other people in our profession or around our profession, and we're very interested to hear what you have to say to help so we can all be compliant when the new rule goes into effect.
Kevin, we have another question here, and I think it's a really important one. Somebody has asked, so what is the difference between CFP Board standards and the new regulation best interest? That's a question we received from several individuals. And as you know, the final Reg BI was just passed. CFP Board Standards Resource Commission is in the process of reviewing Reg BI and developing a guidance resource that provides some information for CFP professionals to examine and evaluate about the differences between the two. Of course, when you read the commentary on Reg BI, it doesn't appear that everybody in the affected professional community agrees what Reg BI says and what it means. So ultimately what CFP Board, what our approach has been, is that we're developing guidance materials that explain what our standards mean. So we've already come out with a number of resources that are intended to do that. We'll continue to do it, but we are working on a document that will provide some information to CFP professionals who are seeking to compare Reg BI and CFP Board's code and standards.
So what are some other material that has been created? So the first document that the Standard Resource Commission created was a frequently asked questions document. And that was really right after the release of the new code and standard. CFP Board received a number of questions, and what we did as a commission is we kind of grouped those questions together and really responded to what we thought were the most pressing questions that were being asked by CFP professionals. And so that document, again, that's up on the CFP website. You can get that right where you can find the roadmap and other material rated around the new Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. You should have also all received, because the CFP Board mailed to us, that brochure, which is that middle document. It's a brochure on the new Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. It's a great summary, and also has that poster, which is that last document on the Code of Ethics. That's something that we've heard a lot of positive feedback on, that CFP professionals like actually hanging that in their office or in their conference room to show that they are CFP and they are abiding by the Code of Ethics.
All right, I want to turn to something now that's really, really important. This is, so, Kevin was with me in San Francisco when we were going through and holding a public forum. Since we began this process of revising our standards, we've held nearly 30 public forums with hundreds, if not thousands, of CFP professionals have participated in those. And the feedback has been so phenomenally helpful, not just for the organization in setting the standards, but I know for Kevin and your team as you're working on developing these guidance resources. And one message that we heard from CFP professionals is that they like the idea of CFP Board creating illustrations, putting together what we call case studies where you're applying the code and standards. And so what this means is that CFP Board is developing materials and creating factual circumstances where the factual circumstance is then applied in the context of our standards. So this is to help give practical guidance to CFP professionals and their firms. Again, a hypothetical factual circumstance, it asks a question about a CFP professional's duty and then presents response options. So you're given several choices. What is the response? A, B, C, could be A, B, C, D. And then we go through and identify the best response and then talk about the rationale for why that response is the best and then why the other responses are not the best. If you participated in the Ethics CE program, this is a format that also appears there. And then, of course, in the public forums, for those of you who even had the pleasure to meet in person, we've used that as well. And we found that the CFP professional communities responded very positively to this, that they really like this type of guidance resource. And so we intend for these case studies, so fiduciary duty, it's a principles-based standard, act as a fiduciary. That comes up in a myriad number of ways. CFP Board can't possibly categorize and catalog every single possible circumstances that you as a CFP professional may face. But what we can do is put together some illustrations, share with you from CFP Board's perspective how that should be handled, and then enable you to apply these same standards to your own circumstances, having the benefit of looking at the materials that we've created. So you can see here we've already put out 12 of these case studies dealing with issues like the fiduciary duty and how that applies to a rollover recommendation, What about disclosing material conflicts when you're making a rollover recommendation? That the fiduciary duty applies when you're making an opinion about a financial asset. More issues on conflicts. One, when responding to a client's inquiry, and then also when recommending a product that an affiliate has issued. We look at, what about when a client tells you they want to use, they have an instruction for you. In this case, the one we used is where they have a specific firm that they want to use for execution. We know that CFP professionals are working in teams. This first set of case studies takes our first stab at providing guidance on that front, the duty to communicate team member responsibilities. Again, obtaining factual information when working on a team. So we have a couple situations we've addressed where a CFP professional is working as part of a team. Kevin, I know you've done a lot with this one. Is when does financial advice require financial planning? We have a case study we put out on that. When does a client have a reasonable basis to believe that you're providing financial planning? And then a couple more fiduciary duty issues, making clear that that duty does not apply when you're providing general financial educational materials. And also it doesn't apply in a different circumstance when you're providing those materials concerning retirement planning. So we're working hard. The Standards Resource Commission is continuing to meet on a regular basis, holding a lot of meetings to develop even more case studies. Expect those to continue to roll out. We're anticipating having more of those before we get to October 1st. And let me just go through, and Kevin and I will maybe just touch on a couple of these quickly, and then maybe turn to some more questions so that you can understand where CFP Board is going with its guidance resources. And then we're going to conclude by telling you how you can reach out to us. How can you share your ideas with us so that the Standards Resource Commission can take it into account as it's developing new materials? So here we have one on the fiduciary duty. It's the third case study. So here you have Allison, a CFP professional, is a registered rep of a broker-dealer. She's providing brokerage services to a client. Done that several times over the past 3 years. Typically what the client wants to do is to purchase a specific stock, and this time the client asks Allison for her opinion before purchasing it. So you recently asked Allison, what do you think about me buying a specific stock that I intend to purchase? And the CFP professional says to the client, I've looked into the company, I like the stock, and I believe it's undervalued. And then the client directs the CFP professional to purchase the stock. So the question becomes, does Allison have a fiduciary duty? So here are the response options, A, B, C, D. Go ahead and type in which one you think it is. A is Allison doesn't have that duty because the client, how do you say it? The client, what is the name of the client? Mateo identified the specific stock. Or B, Allison has the duty because she provided advice when she communicated with Mateo regarding the advisability of purchasing that stock. C is Allison does not have a duty because Mateo ultimately was the one who directed Allison to buy the stock after Allison had that communication. And then D, a fiduciary duty because of the fact that she affected the stock transaction. So the question here is, what's the right response? I'm looking at the responses that are coming in, and I'm seeing everybody, we're getting some good responses here. This is an audience that knows its stuff. B is the correct response to this case study. Mateo asked Allison about the stock before making a decision. If you look at the content, the context, and the presentation of that communication, it makes clear that the client was asking for the CFP professional's recommendation with respect to the advisability of purchasing the stock. And when the CFP professional responded saying, I like the stock, it's undervalued, she made a communication that reasonably would be viewed as a recommendation. So in the case study, we're not providing it all here, but the case study goes through in great depth why this is the best response and why the others are not the best response.
And if you go back to kind of the slide that we went over about when am I providing financial advice and when am I not providing financial advice, again, it's that would it be reasonably viewed as a recommendation to the client, and that's why B is correct, because they are providing financial advice because they're giving a recommendation about a stock. So let's go over one more. We have 12 case studies that got released. This was case study number 9, financial advice. So Bob is 50 years old. He's divorced with no children and rents his home. His only significant assets are $300,000 invested in a bank savings account and $200,000 is accumulated in his firm's 401k plan. He asked Gina, a CFP professional, to manage the assets currently held in his bank savings account, manage his cash flow, and plan for his retirement. Bob also tells Gina that he wants to focus on his long-term financial outlook. They agree that Gina will develop recommendations for the assets currently invested in the bank savings account, make cash flow recommendations, and develop long-term planning scenarios that include retirement projections. Gina and Bob enter into an investment advisor agreement so that Gina can manage the assets currently invested in Bob's savings account. Is Gina providing financial advice that requires financial planning? So again, here we pretty much make it just a binary decision here. It's either yes, Gina is providing financial advice that requires financial planning, or B, no, Gina is not providing financial advice that requires financial planning. So we'll wait a little bit. Let's get some answers here. Good. Yep. Lou, we're getting a lot of A's, and so the answer we're looking for.
Kevin, are we taking away CP certification for anybody who gets this one wrong? How does that work?
I don't know. You'll have to decide that. It's way above my pay grade. So the answer is yes, Gina is providing financial advice that requires financial planning. And so if you remember, if we go back to how do I know if I'm providing financial planning, there's really 3 ways that you either have agreed to provide financial planning, which means you and the client have an agreement to do it. The client has a reasonable basis to believe that you're providing or will provide financial planning, or you're giving financial advice that requires the integration of relevant elements of a client's personal and financial circumstance. And so here, that's where the integration factors apply. And with this case, if you think about it, again, those 5 integration factors are the number of relevant elements, the portion and the amount of the client's financial assets that are affected, the length of time that the client's circumstances may be affected, the effect on the client's overall exposure to risk, and the barrier to modify those actions if the client wants to undo it. And so if you think about how the CFP board would weigh these integration factors, Gina's addressing Bob's needs or desire to develop goals, manage assets and liabilities, and manage cash flow, increase wealth, prepare for retirement. Gina will be managing the funds currently in Bob's savings account, which has a higher value than any of other Bob's asked for. Therefore, Gina's advice will affect a significant portion of Bob's assets. Bob has asked Gina to focus on his long-term financial outlook, including long-term planning scenarios. Therefore, Gina's financial advice will likely affect Bob's personal and financial circumstances for a long time. Gina will recommend that Bob reallocate the assets currently held at a bank savings account, thereby altering the risk-return profile of his holdings, increasing Bob's exposure to risk. So based on all of those factors, this would be, if you looked at this would be financial advice that requires financial planning. So that's why A was the correct answer.
Thank you, Kevin. You know, we're getting close to 4 o'clock, but we want to tell you what's next. We designed this program for 1 hour, and the reason is because we've listened to you. We've heard from CFP professionals that as we provide this material, it's better to have a program that goes for an hour as opposed to 3. I'm glad to see that we're able to fit it in the time frame. Kevin, I want to thank you on behalf of the CFP board, on behalf of the profession. Thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
It's an enormous amount of time you're spending working with us to help to provide the guidance materials and to be here with us today. We're very appreciative of that. In fact, I want to thank every member of the Standards Resource Commission. I've already mentioned Blaine Aiken, Pam Banks, Pat Daxon, Melanie Fine, Randy Gardner, Linda Lights, Jean Maloney, John Petit, Bill Pruitt, Fred Reich, Peter Richardson, Lori Trewinski, Barb Roper, Steve Samuels, and Karim Lynn, as well as Brian Waldo. Brian, if you're there, we haven't forgotten about you for the time that you spent working with us on the Standards Resource Commission. Thank you for all you're doing to develop these materials, and a special nod, Kevin, to the Business Model Council, the members of which have been extraordinarily helpful in helping us think of the vision for this roadmap document and thinking through how we might provide materials for CFP professionals and their firms that's useful to them. And so the way to reach out to us, again, the resources are located at www.cfp.net/code. It's visible here on the screen. If you have suggestions, we're looking for ideas for resources. Of course, there's the Standards Resource Commission is very busy working on guidance resources. We can't provide guidance on every question that comes in, but we'll evaluate your suggestion and think about, is that the kind of resource we should be creating? So if you have it, src@cfpboard.org is the email address to use. And we've tried to blend in your questions during the presentation. We were able to do many, but not all. But I want to thank all of you who participated in this webinar. Thank you for spending an hour of your day to be with us as we presented this roadmap to the code and standards. And just so you know, we've been asked about this. This does not qualify for CE credit. But again, thank you very much for your time. And then, Kevin, unless you have anything else, I think this is the conclusion of the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Leo.